After the end of World War II, the topic of the detention of German prisoners of war in the USSR remained closed. Despite the fact that the society was aware of the involvement of former soldiers and officers of the Wehrmacht in the restoration of war-torn cities, work on construction sites and factories, this issue was not discussed. Official data on this topic was strictly regulated, and some of the information remained classified. According to Soviet archives, 3,486,206 soldiers of Germany and its allies were captured. Of this number, 2,388,443 were Germans, including interned civilians of German origin from various European countries. To accommodate such a large number of prisoners, over 300 special camps were created under the jurisdiction of the NKVD's main Directorate for Prisoners of War and Internees, designed to accommodate from 100 to 4,000 people. Despite all efforts, conditions in the camps remained difficult, resulting in high casualties. 356,700 people died in captivity, which was 14.9% of the total number of German prisoners of war. German sources put the figure at 3.5 million prisoners of war and 1 million dead in captivity. This discrepancy is explained by accounting difficulties and a number of factors. After being captured, many soldiers were initially held at assembly points or in temporary army camps, where the number of prisoners was reduced due to deaths from wounds, executions, escapes, or suicide. Some of the prisoners, especially of Romanian, Slovak, and Hungarian nationalities, were released right at the front, which also lowered the official figures. The Germans, in an effort to avoid harsh treatment, often named another nationality during their captivity. Separate problems were caused by the accounting of prisoners who were part of various formations of the Wehrmacht, such as the Volkssturm, SS, SA, construction and auxiliary battalions. Their status was often not clearly defined, which led to inconsistencies in the data. Every prisoner of war in the Soviet Union was subjected to a multi-stage interrogation. NKVD officers carefully collected evidence, interviewed his subordinates, as well as residents of the occupied territories. If evidence of involvement in war crimes was found, the prisoner's fate was decided by a military tribunal. The punishment ranged from execution to hard labor. From 1943 to 1949, 37,600 prisoners of war were convicted in the USSR. In the first years after the capture, until 1945, about 10,700 people were sentenced. The main surge in convictions occurred in 1949 to 1950, when about 26,000 more sentences were handed down. Of the total number of convicts, 263 were sentenced to death, while the rest were sent to hard labor for up to 25 years. The convicts served their sentences in Vorkuta, in the Krasnokamsk region, where prisoners of war were held accused of links with the Gestapo, atrocities in the occupied territories, and sabotage activities. Among the prisoners of war were high-ranking German soldiers. 376 Wehrmacht generals were captured, of whom 277 subsequently returned to their homeland. The remaining 99 people died in captivity, including 18 generals hanged on charges of war crimes. Despite strict control, there were periodic escapes, riots, and uprisings among the prisoners of war. Between 1943 and 1948, 11,403 people escaped from the camps. Most of the fugitives were detained. 10,445 people, 958 prisoners of war were killed during the pursuit, and only 342 managed to escape. A major uprising took place in January 1945 in a camp near Minsk. Dissatisfied with the meager food, the prisoners rebelled, barricaded themselves in the barracks, and took the guards hostage. NKVD troops were sent to suppress the rebellion, which used artillery. The storming of the barracks ended with the death of more than 100 prisoners. The detention of German prisoners of war in Soviet camps, especially during the war, was extremely difficult. Cold overcrowding, unsanitary conditions, and outbreaks of infectious diseases have become a daily reality. The death rate among prisoners due to malnutrition, wounds, and diseases in the war and the first post-war years reached tragic levels. The winter of 1945 to 1946 turned out to be particularly harsh, with a death rate of up to 70%. However, in the following years, these figures were reduced. Overall, 14.9% of prisoners of war died during their stay in Soviet camps. For comparison, 58% of Soviet soldiers died in the camps of the Third Reich, which demonstrates the horrific scale of their suffering. The fate of the 90,000-strong German group that surrendered at Stalingrad turned out to be especially difficult. Weakened, hungry, and half-naked, the soldiers were forced to make grueling winter marches of tens of kilometers per day. They had to spend the night in the open air, while the prisoners were practically not fed. By the end of the war, only about 6,000 people from this group had survived. The diary of General Serov, who was sent by Stalin to arrange accommodation, food, and treatment for prisoners after the Battle of Stalingrad, describes a terrifying episode. The general saw many dead prisoners on the roads. After catching up with the convoy, he witnessed how the convoy sergeant finished off the weakened Germans with a pistol shot. When Serov asked on whose orders he was acting, the sergeant replied that he had decided it on his own. The general immediately forbade such actions, ordering exhausted prisoners to be sent by car to the camp. Nevertheless, the conditions of detention remained extremely difficult. The column, which was placed in dilapidated stables, began to die en masse. They were stacked in huge pits, sprinkled with lime, and buried with tractors. The use of prisoner of war labor during the war and the post-war devastation became an important part of the economic recovery of the USSR. To maintain the prisoners' working capacity, it was necessary to provide them with at least minimal nutrition. The daily ration included 400 grams of bread. After 1943, this norm was increased to 600 to 700 grams, 100 grams of fish, 100 grams of cereals, 500 grams of vegetables and potatoes, 20 grams of sugar, and 30 grams of salt. However, during the war years, rations were often not delivered in full and were replaced by affordable products. Nutrition standards also depended on production. For example, in 1944, 500 grams of bread were supposed to meet up to 50% of the norm, 600 grams for 80%, and 700 grams for meeting more than 80%. Hunger and lack of resources caused people to degrade, turning them into desperate fighters for survival. Groups of the healthiest prisoners formed in the camps who took food from the weak. There were often fights over a piece of bread, and gold, for example, from knocked-out teeth, was exchanged for cigarettes or additional products. The Germans despised their former allies. The Italians and Romanians robbed them of food, often killing them in fights. The Italians and Romanians, in turn, took jobs at food distribution points and reduced portions to the Germans, giving food to their own. Due to severe hunger, cases of cannibalism were even recorded in the camps. The German surrender was a psychological blow to many prisoners. Loss of courage and hopelessness often led to suicide. Some deliberately mutilated themselves in the hope of repatriation, but such attempts remained futile. Despite the difficult conditions, the labor of the prisoners became an important factor in the restoration of the national economy. Millions of people worked in construction sites, factories, and fields. German prisoners, as a rule, demonstrated good faith and iron discipline, which led to a joke. Of course, the Germans built it. This phrase became a meme reflecting their well-known diligence. The labor of millions of prisoners, despite all the difficulties and sufferings, helped to revive the destroyed cities and industry of the country. Germans who found themselves in Soviet captivity could not help but be surprised by the peculiarities of Russian work, in particular the negligent attitude towards work, which they dubbed the word hack. However, they themselves, despite the difficult conditions, demonstrated German pedantry and discipline. In addition to physical hardships, prisoners had certain privileges. Privates received 7 rubles a month, officers 10, generals 30. Bonuses of up to 50 rubles are provided for shock work. Generals, however, did not have the right to attendance, and prisoners could receive letters and money transfers from their homeland. The labor of prisoners was used at the most important construction sites of the Soviet Union. Among them are the Kuybishevskaya and Kakhovskaya HPPs, plants in Chelyabinsk and Vladimir, and the construction of the Karakum Canal. The Germans restored the mines of Donbass, the Zaporizhstal and Azovstal plants, heating mains and gas pipelines. They took part in the construction of such facilities as the Moscow State University, the Kurchatov Institute, the Dynamo Stadium in Moscow, and also built the Moscow-Kharkov-Simferopol and Moscow-Minsk highways. In Krasnogorsk, they built a school, the Zenit City Stadium, houses for workers, and a well-maintained residential town with a cultural center. Many people especially remember the camp of German prisoners of war engaged in the construction of the Moscow-Simferopol highway. After the work was completed, the Germans were deported and the camp became a cannery warehouse. One of the eyewitnesses, recalling his childhood, describes how he and his friends, as children, penetrated under the barbed wire to get sweets. Wooden barrels of jam were stored in the camp, and the children enthusiastically knocked out the plugs to feast. The camp itself was surrounded by 2 rows of barbed wire about 4 meters high, and inside there were long dugouts in which prisoners lived. The dugouts had earthen bunks covered with straw, where the builders slept. The Spartan conditions in which the prisoners of war were located contrasted with the grandeur of the facilities they built. Later, the camp was demolished and a modern neighborhood grew up in its place. The Moscow-Simferopol highway itself, built by German prisoners of war, was admired for its thoughtful infrastructure. Although it was narrow by modern standards, the engineering solutions used in its construction were impressive. Special attention was drawn to the construction of rain drains. Cascades of connected horizontal concrete platforms carefully diverted water into ravines. Framed by lime-painted balustrades, these structures looked not only functional, but also aesthetically pleasing. Unfortunately, today you will no longer find such elegant engineering solutions on Russian roads. Everything has been destroyed by time, and as often happens, by Russian carelessness. In addition to highways, prisoners of war participated in large numbers in the dismantling of rubble and the restoration of cities destroyed by the war. Minsk, Kiev, Stalingrad, Sevastopol, Leningrad, Kharkov, Lugansk, and many others. They built apartment buildings, hospitals, theaters, hotels, and urban infrastructure. Even in cities relatively untouched by the war, such as Chelyabinsk, Sverdlovsk, and Novosibirsk, prisoners built entire neighborhoods. In Minsk, for example, up to 60% of the restoration work was carried out by their hands. In Kiev, they reconstructed Kreshchatyk, and in Sverdlovsk, they built significant residential areas. In 1947, 1 in 5 workers on the construction sites of ferrous and non-ferrous metallurgy enterprises was a prisoner of war in the aviation industry, almost 1 in 3, and in the construction of power plants, 1 in 6. But their work was not limited to physical work. In the camps of the Gutfy system, qualified specialists were identified: engineers, physicists, chemists, and even scientists with doctoral and professorial degrees. As of October 1945, 581 specialists were specially registered in the Gutfy, whose skills were used at key industrial facilities of the Soviet Union. Special conditions were created for these people. Many were transferred from camps, provided housing near their places of work, and paid salaries at the level of Soviet engineers. In 1947, the USSR, the USA, and Great Britain agreed on the repatriation of German prisoners of war. The gradual process of their return to Germany began, and the distribution took place depending on their place of residence, in the GDR or the FRG. Repatriation dragged on until 1950, as the most weakened and sick were sent first, as well as those who were employed in less significant jobs. However, prisoners of war convicted of war crimes remained in the Soviet Union and were not subject to return. In 1955, the Supreme Soviet of the USSR issued a decree on the early release of those convicted of war crimes, which made it possible to complete this process. The last batch of German prisoners was handed over to the German authorities in January 1956, marking the end of one of the largest episodes of the use of prisoners in post-war history. Interestingly, not all captured Germans wanted to return to their homeland. By an amazing coincidence, up to 58,000 people expressed a desire to emigrate to the newly formed Israel. This unexpected initiative was supported, and the former prisoners of war played a significant role in strengthening the Israeli army, which was formed with the participation of Soviet military instructors. The Germans brought valuable military discipline, experience, and knowledge to its ranks, significantly strengthening the young state at the stage of its formation.